The darkness before the dawn was not a peaceful one. On a still, black night in February, a line of shadows cut through the water. They move with silent, predatory grace, their outlines blurred against the inky sea, heading for the slumbering giants anchored in the distant roadstead. This was a surgical strike, a dagger aimed at the heart of a sleeping empire. The Pacific Fleet lay at rest, crews ashore, confidence a warm blanket against the chill. They did not know their world was about to end. But this is not the story you think it is. This is not Pearl Harbor. It is 1904. The warships are Japanese. The fleet is Russian. And the thunder about to erupt from the silence will not just shatter ships. It will shatter centuries of imperial certainty, unleash a storm of steel and fire that will drown thousands in mud and blood, and send the first, tremulous shockwave to the foundations of the old world. They called it a regional conflict. History would remember it as World War Zero. By the turn of the 20th century, the world had been carved up by empires whose power seemed as eternal as stone. In the East, a new and hungry power had emerged from centuries of isolation, its soul transformed by a furious, desperate modernization. Japan had consumed Western science, technology, and tactics with feverish intensity, compressing centuries of European development into mere decades. It was a metamorphosis born of survivalist terror, a realization that to remain soft was to be devoured. This new entity, clad in Prussian army uniforms and sailing British-built battleships, now gazed across the sea with eyes that saw not neighbors but obstacles. And the greatest obstacle was a vast, lumbering bear of Russia, which had pushed its iron rails eastward, founding cities with names like Lord of the East, its gaze fixed on Korea and the warm water ports of China. To Japan, this was a dagger pointing at its heart. Diplomacy became a tense, silent game of chess played over maps of Manchuria, a game the Russians believed they could not lose, convinced of their racial and imperial superiority. The Tsar's court dripped with contempt for the upstart nation. War, if it came, would be a brief, chastising expedition. They did not hear the clock ticking down in Tokyo, where a nation had mortgaged its very soul to machinery of war, where 82% of the national budget fed an army of 400,000 and a fleet that was now the fourth largest on Earth. Japan was not preparing for a war. It was preparing for an execution. The plan was born in shadow and audacity. Knowing Russia's bottomless reserves of men and money, Japan's high command understood their war must be short, shocking, and utterly decisive. It would be a gamble with the nation's entire existence as a stake. The army would land, advance, and win crushing victories on land. But first, the sea must be made a Japanese lake. The Russian Pacific Fleet, divided between Port Arthur and Vladivostok, had to be neutralized. And so, the architects of war in Tokyo devised an opening move so ruthless it would become a dark template for the century to come, a surprise attack, before the declaration of war was even delivered. On the night of February 8, 1904, 10 Japanese destroyers, like wolves separating from the pack, slipped away from Admiral Togo's main force. Their engines were muted, running lights extinguished. Ahead, the yellow glow of Port Arthur's harbor lights shimmered on the water, outlining the silhouettes of battleships at anchor. The Russians were complacent. Torpedo nets were only partially deployed. Many officers were at a party on the flagship Petropavlovsk. The scent of vodka and cigars drifted on the breeze, not gunpowder. The Japanese captains watched, waited, and closed the distance. At 11:30 p.m., the first torpedoes slipped into the water, their trails of bubbles gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The explosions that followed were not the opening salvos of a war, but a gut punch to an empire. The cruiser Pauletta shuddered. The Retvizin lurched. On the battleship Tsarevich, an officer recalled the chaos. The frantic order for torpedo defense, the scramble on deck just in time to see the white wake aimed directly at his ship's heart. The night erupted in flame and confusion. Strategically, the attack was only a partial success. The Russian ships were damaged, not destroyed. But psychologically, it was a masterpiece of terror. The Russian admiralty, rattled and cautious, ordered the fleet to remain in port, ceding the sea to Japan. The trap had been sprung. The first blood was in the water. On land, the war began with the slow, inevitable grind of armies colliding, The Japanese First Army poured into Korea, a tidal wave of khaki and determination, pushing north towards a natural fortress of the Yalu River. There, the Russians waited, confident in their defensive position and the reputation of their Cossack cavalry. But this was a new kind of army. Japanese scouts disguised as Korean fishermen mapped every Russian gun emplacement. Artillery was dug in and camouflaged with meticulous care, while the Russians, in a display of arrogant negligence, moved their large guns in the open. When the battle came, it was a lesson in asymmetrical slaughter. The Russian commander, expecting a direct assault, held his line as a Japanese division executed a daring flanking march, crossing the river miles away and seizing the high ground. Then the hidden Japanese gun spoke. A Russian officer described the horror of modern artillery, shells falling with mathematical precision on entrenched positions, turning earth and men into a common paste. The Japanese infantry, chanting military songs to keep their nerve, advanced to a hail of rifle fire. Captain Takemine remembered the surreal fury, soldiers moving through smoke and bullets, in high spirits, the vigor that could never be seen in ordinary training. The Russian line broke, not with a heroic last stand, but in panicked, confused retreat through narrow gorges that became killing zones. The Battle of the Yalu was a clear signal. The Japanese soldier, driven by a fanatical code of Bushido where duty was heavier than a mountain and death lighter than a feather, was a formidable instrument. But this code would soon demand a horrifying price. That price was to be extracted at Port Arthur. The fortified naval base, now cut off by land and sea, became the bloody pivot of the war. The Japanese Third Army, under General Nogi Mirsuk, laid siege. Nogi had taken port easily a decade prior. Now, he faced a labyrinth of concrete forts, machine gun nests, and miles of barbed wire. What followed was a descent into a new circle of hell. The Russian defenders, armed with modern rifles, machine guns, and even improvised hand grenades, mowed down wave after wave of Japanese infantry. Nogi, under immense pressure for a quick victory, resorted to tactics of sheer, horrifying mass. He ordered Nikuden Kogiki, human bullet attacks. Men advanced in dense lines, not to overcome the enemy with tactics, but to overwhelm him with corpses. A Buddhist chaplain, Mamiya Eiju, witnessed the aftermath, a vision that would haunt him forever. The dead were not whole men. They were fragments. Some were missing half of their bodies. Some had their heads torn off with only the skin attached. Some had their shoes filled with the flesh of their feet. He wrote, his words trembling with trauma. No illustration of the Buddhist hells has ever portrayed such cruelties. The Japanese government hid the scale of the slaughter. 16,000 men lost in a single assault. But the truth festered within the army. Port Arthur became a meat grinder, its hills soaked with blood, a grim preview of the Western Front that would emerge a decade later. It was a victory purchased not with strategy, but with suffering, and it left a deep, psychic scar on the nation's soul. While the land war consumed men in a storm of shrapnel and mud, the war at sea reached a desperate climax. The Russian Baltic Fleet, renamed the Second Pacific Squadron in a fit of hollow optimism, had embarked on an epic, farcical, 8-month voyage from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific. It was a journey of global humiliation, accidentally firing on British fishing trawlers in the North Sea, causing an international incident, suffering breakdowns and coal shortages in tropical heat, enduring simmering mutinies among demoralized sailors. Its commander, Admiral Zinovy Rozhesvinsky, reportedly called some of his older vessels self-sinkers. By the time this ragged, exhausted armada approached Japanese waters in May 1905, it was less a fighting force and more a floating epitaph for imperial overreach. Admiral Togo Hayakairo and his combined fleet, by contrast, were rested, repaired, and razor-sharp. They knew every mile of the Russians' tortured journey. Togo chose his killing ground, the narrow Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. He would not just defeat the Russians, he would annihilate them. On the morning of May 27, 1905, the two fleets sighted each other. The Russians, in a ragged line, hoped only burst through to Vladivostok. Togo executed a breathtakingly audacious maneuver. He steamed across the front of the Russian column, then led his entire fleet in a simultaneous U-turn, allowing his ships to bring all their broadside guns to bear while masking the Russians' forward fire. For Admiral Akiyama Seinyuki, the mastermind of Japanese naval tactics, This was the moment of terrifying culmination. The Navy had been built up through many years of painstaking work, he reflected. But all came to a head in a mere 30-minute maneuver, a decade-long war. What followed was not a battle, but a demolition. The Japanese gunnery was faster, more accurate, and relentless. The Russian ships, their hulls foul from the long voyage, were slower to maneuver. The Japanese shells, fused with new, devastating explosive called Shermos, erupted in great gouts of flame and splintered steel. On the Russian flagship Suvorov, Admiral Rozhesensky was wounded early as fires raged out of control. A sailor on a nearby destroyer watched in horror as the battleship Oslabia rolled over and died. The whole of the starboard side laid bare. Her bright plating looked like the wet scales of some sea monster. Men jumped down upon these scales. Most were dashed against the keel. A few more seconds and the Oslabia disappeared. One by one, the great Russian battleships were pounded into sinking wrecks. By nightfall, the strait was a flaming cemetery. Torpedo boats finished the work in the darkness. The next morning, the few remaining Russian ships, shattered and listing, surrendered. The scale of the victory was biblical. Of 38 Russian warships, 34 were sunk, captured, or interned. Over 5,000 Russian sailors were killed. Japanese losses were 3 torpedo boats and 110 men. Tsushima was the most complete naval victory in modern history, a shock that reverberated around the globe. In colonized nations from India to Vietnam, people whispered that a European giant could be felled. In the admiralties of Britain and Germany, men studied the reports and saw the terrifying future of naval warfare. The twin shocks of Port Arthur's fall and the Tsushima catastrophe broke Russia's will to fight. Inside the empire, the war's staggering costs and humiliations ignited the fuse of revolution. Strikes paralyzed cities, and mutinies like that on the battleship Potemkin revealed the rotten core of the Tsarist regime. Japan, though victorious, was militarily and financially exhausted, a nation bleeding from every vein. In the quiet seaside town of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, brokered by an ambitious American President Theodore Roosevelt, the two wounded giants made peace. The Treaty of Portsmouth gave Japan everything it fought for: dominance in Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula, and southern Sakhalin. But there was no massive cash indemnity to refill Japan's empty coffers. When the terms reached Tokyo, the public, fed only on news of glorious victories, erupted in violent riots. They felt betrayed, not understanding that their nation was, in truth, propped up by the last of its strength. In Russia, the treaty was a mere footnote to the existential crisis now engulfing the empire. The 1905 revolution, though ultimately suppressed, was a dress rehearsal for the apocalyptic storm of 1917. The Russo-Japanese War faded from Western memory, overshadowed by the cataclysm that followed in 1914. But its shadow was long and dark. It was the first major war of the industrialized 20th century, revealing the murderous potential of machine guns, quick-fire and artillery, and trench warfare. It demonstrated that modern wars could consume men at a rate previously unimaginable. It shattered the myth of European invincibility and announced Japan's brutal arrival as a great power, setting it on a collision course with the West that would end in fire over Pearl Harbor and the ashes of Hiroshima. It fatally weakened Tsarist Russia, priming it for collapse. And it showed the world a surprise attack, a ruthless opening strike against an unprepared foe, could be the key to victory, a lesson meticulously studied in Berlin, Tokyo, and elsewhere. The men who died in the mud of Mukden, on the slopes of Port Arthur, and in the steel coffins of Tsushima were not just casualties of a regional conflict. They were the first victims of a new, mechanistic age of horror. Their war was not the last of the old conflicts, but the terrifying prologue to all that was to come. The echoes of those first shots in Port Arthur Harbor would resonate for 40 years. Through the trenches of Flanders, the bombing of Guernica, and the blitzkriegs across Europe, until the world finally understood the true meaning of total war. This was where the century's bloodletting truly began. This was World War Zero. And so, the shadows that first crossed Port Arthur's waters did more than sink ships. They heralded the dawn of a new, merciless century. The world had changed in a single, devastating war, and the echoes of those bullets, shells, and firestorms would ripple through history for generations. From the frozen ports of Russia to the battlefields of Europe, From the rise of empires to their violent collapse, the lessons of World Zero were etched in blood and steel. Remember this. The first shots may seem distant, the empire's long gone, but the patterns of ambition, fear, and ruthless calculation they reveal remain as relevant today as they were on that cold February night in 1904. History does not forgive, and those who ignore its warnings are doomed to repeat its horrors. If this journey through history gripped you, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with anyone who loves history, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the hidden battles and shocking events that shaped our world. The story of World Zero ends here, but the shadows it casts still stretch across our century.